With our Tekno EB410.2 buggy now taking shape, it's time to finish up on the chassis with its various mounting brackets for electronics. Although before we do that, we need to get through the next two bags, K and L, front and rear shock assembly. Bag K contains the front shock kit. Lots of small parts in this, so take care to empty its contents, making sure nothing is left behind in the bag. The shocks are basically the same as the previous version of the buggy, with only some slight differences, including front red springs, revised shock inserts, 8-hole pistons, and updated shock standoff bushings, all stock on the new kit. You'll need some thread lock as well as some O-ring grease for this bag, so with those to hand, let's get started. With the main shock body in hand, place the black rubber O-ring around the top threads, making sure it seats nicely down into the groove. Next, I like to give all O-rings and inserts a small coat of shock O-ring grease, after which we can drop in a shock X-ring, followed by a small Delrin washer, another shock X-ring, and top off with a hatch washer with the raised piece facing upwards. We can then screw down the cap just so it's snug, holding everything in place. Don't over tighten just yet, as we want to get the shock shaft through first. Talking of the shock shaft, we need to attach our shock piston, so drop it in place on top of the shock shaft, not the threaded end, making sure the writing on the piston faces upwards, after which we can insert a 5mm piston screw, bearing in mind it's metal into metal here, so apply some thread lock and tighten into place. Before inserting into the shock body, apply some grease to the threads to prevent it from tearing any O-rings, before pushing through the body, and then wipe off any excess grease once through. With the shock shaft through, we can now tighten up the shock cartridge, making sure the shock shaft is nice and smooth. Finally, grip the shock shaft with the Tekno shock tool so it's not marked in any way, and proceed to install the rod end. You want to make sure the rod ends on each shock pair go on the same amount, 23mm on this front set. You don't want different sized shocks because the rod ends have been screwed on different levels. So with it in place, pop a pivot ball through the rod end and make sure the ball moves freely. Finally, we can install the shock collar, so pop an O-ring into the groove on the inside and apply some grease to the threads to help it go on easier, after which we can go ahead and screw it onto the shock body. With one shock complete, we need to go ahead and create the second front shock too, so O-ring on shock body, followed by the internal rings, final hatch washer, and top cap. Then we drop the piston onto the shock shaft and tighten with the piston screw, taking care not to over tighten, mind. Grease the end and insert into the body, secure the rod end, propping a pivot ball into place, before attaching the shock collar with its O-ring in place. A final check to ensure everything is super smooth and free. And with that done, we're ready to fill the shocks with the provided 600 weight oil. So we go ahead and proceed to fill the shock. I like to go around halfway, then move the shock shaft up and down a little just to get rid of any air trapped beneath, taking care not to push the piston above the oil fill level. Then go ahead and fill the remainder of the shock body to the top, after which we pump the shock shaft from bottom to top around 5 times. At this point, I like to place the shock to one side, being careful to support it upwards on something if you haven't a shock stand, and proceed to complete the same process on the second shock, so fill with oil and pump the shock shaft a few times. While we let those sit, we can prepare the caps by adding an O-ring inside each cap, followed by greasing the tiny O-rings and preparing the bleed screws. Back to the first shock now, which has been sitting for a few minutes. I like to add a few drops of oil into the cap before installing it all the way tight, being careful not to cross thread. You'll find the shock tool useful in holding the shock hair, and the Tekno wheel wrench, which has a shock cap tool in the top, handy for helping tighten the shock cap right down. You will have some oil leak out of the bleed hole, which is what we want. If no oil leaks through, then the shock needs more oil inside. Once in place, hold the shock at a 45-degree angle with the bleed hole facing upwards. Slowly press the shock shaft so that it's all the way to the top, wiping away any excess oil. And while holding, insert the bleed screw into the cap until snug. Next, we need to pump the shock shaft up and down vigorously around 20 times or so in order to emulsify the oil, after which the shaft can be fully extended and the bleed screw removed again facing upwards at an angle, and push the shaft all the way up again, wiping any excess oil if need be, and finally tighten down the bleed screw until snug. And that's it, first shock fully prepared. After replicating the same process on the other shock, we have both front shocks complete. All that's left is to insert the supplied springs and insert a spring perch on the opposite end with an 8mm set screw to secure into place. Finally, insert a shock cap bushing into the shock cap and we're ready to mount to the buggy. When mounting the shocks to the buggy, note that the slot in the spring perch should face the outside of the vehicle. So with that in mind, slide the shock cap onto the shock standoff and screw on a flanged lock nut to secure into place. The bottom of the shock is secured to the suspension arm, the inside hole being the stock position, with a single 18mm shock mount screw securing it into place. Note that the black screw is right-hand threaded and goes in on the left side of the vehicle. Repeat on the opposite side, so lock nut up on the shock standoff, and 18mm shock mount screw on the lower inside hole, this one being silver and left-hand threaded. And with that, our front shocks are complete. Ensure any spring perches face outwards. I also like my bleed screws to face outwards too. The rear shocks in bag L are slightly different to the front, so it's a good idea to build a set at a time rather than get them all mixed up. The shock body is longer, with different rate springs, and the piston is slightly thicker, but otherwise the process in building them is exactly the same, so we won't cover the entire process all over again. But while building these, take note that the rod end should be installed leaving a 29mm gap between the rod end and shock body. And we also have some external limiters on the shock shaft too. So with springs and spring perches installed and secured, as well as the shock cap bushings, we're ready to mount to the buggy. Again, we mount these onto the shock standoffs with a single nut, while taking care to make sure the slot in the spring perch is facing outwards, and again using the black screw on the left side and the silver screw on the right side of the buggy. And we are done. That's bag K and L complete, and both front and rear shocks mounted onto the vehicle. All feels perfectly fluid, and that's pretty much all the main parts of the vehicle built and complete now, and it's looking great so far. In the next part, we move on to bag M, installing some extra parts onto the main chassis ready for electronics.